The studio lights cut through the tension like blades. Kash Patel leaned back in his chair, smirking, tossing out a dismissive jab meant to belittle Jasmine Crockett in front of millions. For a second, it seemed the air itself froze, until Crockett leaned forward, eyes locked, voice steady, and delivered a comeback so sharp, so undeniable, that the audience audibly gasped. It wasn't just words. It was a strike clean and precise, slicing through the arrogance that had hung heavy in the room. Patel's grin faltered. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. This wasn't the script Patel had prepared for. This was the moment Jasmine Crockett seized the narrative, reclaiming dignity in the face of smug dismissal. And, just as her final words landed, a hush swept across the room, the kind of silence that follows a knockout punch no one saw coming. For one electrifying heartbeat, the audience was caught between disbelief and thunderous approval. The question wasn't whether Patel had been outmatched. It was how he would even begin to recover. But before the applause, before the headlines, before the internet erupted, one has to ask, how did we get here? Because what Crockett said next would flip the script entirely. The clash unfolding on live television was never just about two people sharing a stage. It was about the soul of a political moment, the battle lines of a country wrestling with who gets to define truth and who gets to distort it. On one side sat Kash Patel, draped in the confidence of Washington insiders, a man accustomed to dismissing critics with a smirk and shrug. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had clawed her way into public life through determination, integrity, and a refusal to be silenced. Their presence together was no accident. It was a reflection of a nation split between arrogance and authenticity, between those who cling to power with contempt and those who rise from struggle with dignity. The cameras framed every gesture, every pause, every breath. Patel's role was clear: minimize, mock, and dominate. Crockett's task was far heavier. She carried not just her own voice, but the weight of every viewer who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or told they did not belong. The stakes extended beyond the debate table. This was about credibility, representation, and the audacity of truth standing up against rehearsed falsehoods. And yet, as Patel rolled out his rehearsed barbs and crafted interruptions, no one watching had any idea they were seconds away from witnessing a historic exchange. The energy in the studio hinted at a storm building just beneath the surface, a storm ready to break with a force that would ripple far beyond the night's broadcast. What looked like another predictable skirmish in America's endless cycle of political theater was about to transform into something unforgettable. Because when dignity and arrogance collide, it's never just words. It's history being written in real time. And in this moment, with millions leaning forward in their chairs, Jasmine Crockett was preparing to write her line in bold. What came next would not only silence the smirks, but ignite a reaction that neither the studio nor the nation would soon forget. To understand the tension in that studio, you have to know the man who walked in believing he already owned the room. Kash Patel was no stranger to the corridors of power. He had risen through Washington not as a builder of consensus or a quiet servant of the public, but as a loyalist, a fighter, a man who thrived on proximity to the powerful. His career was forged not in the fires of grassroots struggle, but in the shadows of backroom deals and partisan loyalty. To some, Patel was a strategist. To others, he was an opportunist who had learned that swagger and sharp elbows could carry him further than substance ever could. Over the years, Patel became known for his closeness to some of the most controversial figures in American politics. He positioned himself as a defender of those under scrutiny, often turning what should have been accountability into attack. With every television hit and committee appearance, his reputation grew, not as a truth-teller, but as someone who bent reality into whatever shape best served his side. And the more criticism he received, the more his confidence swelled. For Patel, outrage wasn't an obstacle, it was oxygen. That night, his demeanor carried all the hallmarks of that persona. He leaned back in his chair with the air of a man convinced the cameras were his allies, that the audience would see him as the sharp mind dismantling his opponent. It was the same tactic he had used countless times: interrupt, overtalk, dismiss, and then smirk as though the conversation were already decided. He thrived on belittling others, especially those who represented communities or identities he thought he could caricature. But beneath the arrogance lay contradictions that gnawed at the edges of his image. He championed integrity while defending scandals. He claimed loyalty to the people while tethering himself tightly to elite corridors of power. He sold himself as a truth-teller while spinning elaborate narratives that collapsed under scrutiny. Still, Patel carried himself with the conviction of a man convinced that sheer force of personality could overcome substance. He had grown used to environments where bluster went unchallenged and where the louder voice often won. It was in those spaces that he perfected his swagger, believing it could shield him from accountability. And in the echo chambers that cheered him on, arrogance was mistaken for strength. Yet what Patel failed to see was the shift happening in the room that night. Viewers were not simply looking for noise. They were searching for authenticity, for clarity, for someone who could cut through the fog of political theater. Patel's dismissive tone, once celebrated in partisan circles, rang hollow when broadcast to a nation hungry for truth. His overconfidence became the very flaw that would leave him exposed. The smirk that had carried him through countless debates was beginning to look less like confidence and more like a mask for fragility. He had underestimated his opponent. He assumed Jasmine Crockett would play the role of another target for his interruptions, another politician to outtalk. What he didn't understand was that Crockett had lived a story he could not dismiss, a story that armed her with resilience he couldn't anticipate. For Patel, it was just another debate. For Crockett, it was an opportunity to embody the dignity of those who had been told they were less than, and to turn his arrogance against him in a moment that would echo far beyond the studio. Patel believed swagger was enough. He believed dismissiveness would silence his challenger. He believed he could outsmile and outtalk anyone. But Patel didn't realize he was about to face someone who had already walked through fire. Long before the studio lights and the nationwide spotlight, Jasmine Crockett's story began in places where power rarely bothered to look. She was not born into the luxury of political connections or insider privilege. Her foundation was built on determination, on watching injustice play out in everyday life and refusing to accept that silence was the only option. She grew up in communities where opportunity was fought for, not handed down, and it was there she learned the weight of resilience. Her path led her into the world of law, not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. Crockett saw firsthand how marginalized voices were drowned out by money, influence, and arrogance. She stepped into courtrooms as an advocate for the overlooked, often taking cases others dismissed as unwinnable. Each legal fight etched into her the truth that real justice was rarely easy, but always worth the battle. Every setback only sharpened her resolve. Every victory carried the echoes of those she fought for. She became known not just for her skill, but for her fire, the kind of fire that burned steady rather than flashy. Unlike the politicians who chased cameras, Crockett's reputation came from standing firm in spaces where people's futures were on the line. She carried the frustrations of single mothers fighting eviction, workers facing exploitation, young people criminalized for their circumstances. In every case, she wasn't simply defending clients. She was defending the principle that dignity belongs to everyone. It was this journey that made her entry into politics feel less like ambition and more like Colin Crockett did not step into office to perform. She came to amplify the voices she had long represented, to drag the realities of ordinary people into the halls of power where they were too often ignored. And though she entered a world dominated by insiders, she carried herself with the steady composure of someone who had already faced storms and refused to bow. That composure was her armor in the studio that night. To casual viewers, it looked like calm confidence. But to those who knew her story, it was something deeper, the practiced steadiness of someone who had been tested too many times to rattle now. Every smirk Patel offered, every dismissive interruption, bounced off a woman who had fought for far more than a headline moment. Her truth was earned in struggle. Her strength was born of resilience. And her presence at that debate was not just her own. It was the presence of every client, every community member, every unheard voice she had carried with her into rooms where they had been shut out. That authenticity gave her words a weight Patel could not manufacture, a gravity he could not imitate. When Patel looked across the table, he saw another opponent to out-talk. What he did not see was the years of battles that had sharpened her into someone who did not flinch, did not fold, and did not forget who she represented. That night, she brought all of that history with her, each chapter a shield against arrogance, each lesson a blade honed for truth. And that experience was about to become Patel's worst nightmare, live on national TV. The debate began as so many do, two voices talking past each other, sound bites competing for airtime. But almost immediately, Patel's strategy became clear. He interrupted, cutting Crockett off mid-sentence, raising his voice just enough to drown her out. Every time she tried to lay out her point, he would smirk, tilt his head, and deliver a dismissive aside meant to belittle not just her argument, but her very presence at the table. It was arrogance polished into performance, the kind of behavior he had relied on for years. Yet Crockett did not flinch. She sat steady, letting Patel's words tumble out, her eyes steady and unblinking, her posture unbroken. To some, it may have looked like restraint. To those who knew her story, it was something more dangerous. Patience, the kind of patience that waits for the exact moment to strike. Each interruption only tightened the coil of anticipation. Viewers at home began to sense it. The host in the studio exchanged glances, recognizing the shift in energy. Patel was overplaying his hand, and Crockett was letting him dig the hole deeper. The tension grew with each exchange. Patel's voice rose, his smirk widening as if to broadcast confidence. But there was a tremor underneath, a subtle defensiveness creeping in. Crockett's silence between his interruptions became louder than his words, her calm demeanor forming a contrast that made his bluster appear desperate. The more he mocked, the more he revealed his fear of being truly challenged. The audience felt it first. A murmur rippled through the room as Crockett's stillness stretched, as if everyone collectively realized she was preparing something. Even through the cameras, viewers could feel the charge in the air, the sensation that they were seconds away from witnessing something they would remember long after the broadcast ended. And then it happened. Patel launched into another interruption, a dismissive swipe meant to close her down once more. But this time, Crockett did not wait. She shifted in her chair, leaned slightly forward, and locked her eyes on him with a composure that silenced the entire studio. Then, with the entire audience watching, Crockett leaned in. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Patel's smirk lingered, his interruption hanging in the air like an unfinished punchline, waiting for the laughter that never came. The audience, the hosts, even Patel himself seemed suspended in that pause, the kind of pause that carries with it the weight of an incoming storm. And then Jasmine Crockett spoke. Her voice was low at first, measured, deliberate. "You think dismissing me will make my truth smaller," she began, eyes locked on Patel. The smirk on his face faltered just slightly as the tone of her words cut through the air. The studio leaned in. "But I've spent my entire career facing men who thought arrogance was a substitute for facts. And let me tell you something, arrogance doesn't age well when it's stacked against reality." The jab was clean, precise. A ripple of murmurs moved through the audience. Patel tried to interject, his mouth opening as though to regain the ground he had just lost, but Crockett raised her hand slightly, not in a plea for space, but in a gesture of command. The room obeyed her. The cameras shifted, catching Patel's face as his bravado wavered. Then came the strike. Crockett leaned forward, her words sharp enough to pierce the tension like glass breaking. "You parade yourself as a defender of truth, but your record is nothing but contradictions. You call it loyalty, I call it selling out the American people for a seat at the table. And tonight, you thought you could talk over me, dismiss me, belittle me. But here's the difference, Mr. Patel. I earned my place here. You borrowed yours. Gasps filled the room. A few claps broke out before the hosts waved for order. Patel's smile collapsed into a tight grimace, his eyes darting between Crockett and the cameras, suddenly aware that millions were watching him unravel in real time. Crockett did not let up. Her cadence sharpened, each word a deliberate blow. I come from communities you couldn't be bothered to acknowledge until it suited your politics. I've stood with families who had nothing but their dignity left, and I've fought to make sure even that couldn't be stripped away. You don't intimidate me, Mr. Patel, because I've already faced worse than a smirk and an interruption. What you see as power, I see as weakness, and weakness never wins. The audience erupted. Applause rolled through the studio like a wave, unstoppable, undeniable. Even the hosts, who had tried to maintain neutrality, couldn't hide their wide-eyed glances at one another. Patel sat frozen, his hand half raised, as though searching for a point to make, only to find none. His face told the story. What had once been confidence was now desperation. The slow collapse of a man unprepared for the weight of authenticity crashing against him. And Crockett? She sat back, composed, as though she had simply stated a fact rather than dismantled an entire persona. Her calmness was the final humiliation, the confirmation that this was not luck, not accident. This was mastery. For viewers at home, it wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a takedown, a reclaiming of space in real time, proof that dignity could cut sharper than arrogance ever could. Screens lit up with rewinds and clips. Social feeds exploded before the debate had even ended. In living rooms and bars and dorms across the country, people were standing, cheering, clapping at their televisions, united in the collective recognition that they had just witnessed a moment of history. Patel looked down, adjusting his notes, searching for footing that had long since disappeared. He had walked into the studio with a swagger that suggested inevitability. He now sat exposed, undone not by rage, not by theatrics, but by the precise power of a truth he could neither out-talk nor out-smile. The debate had barely wrapped before the first clips hit social media. A 30-second cut of Crockett's takedown rocketed across timelines, racking up thousands of shares in minutes. Within the hour, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Crockett CLAPBACK, hashtag Truth Over Smirks, and the one that stung Patel the most, hashtag Borrowed Seat. Twitter feeds lit up like fireworks, each retweet another cheer echoing across the digital landscape. Memes followed fast. One showed Patel's grin dissolving frame by frame, captioned, "Confidence has left the chat." Another looped Crockett's words, "I earned my place. You borrowed yours," synced perfectly to thunderous applause sound effects. TikTok creators remixed the moment with dramatic music, slow-motion cuts, and even animated edits casting Crockett as a superhero staring down a crumbling villain. Commentators flooded in. Political analysts called it the most decisive debate moment of the year. Progressive voices praised Crockett for embodying dignity in the face of arrogance, while even some conservatives admitted Patel had walked into a trap of his own making. Late-night hosts couldn't resist. Monologues replayed Crockett's line again and again, the punchline writing itself as Patel's expression told the rest of the story. In living rooms, group chats, and campus watch parties, people felt more than entertained. They felt vindicated. For those long dismissed, talked over, or underestimated, Crockett's poise was a mirror reflecting back their own frustrations and their own resilience. Social feeds became less about a single debate and more about a shared catharsis. The clip wasn't just viral. It was symbolic, a shorthand for standing tall against condescension. Meanwhile, Patel became a digital punchline. Every attempt he made to downplay the moment only amplified it. His interviews the next morning were clipped and mocked, each denial paired with side-by-side footage of his grimace in the studio. For a man who once thrived on controlling the narrative, Patel found himself trapped inside one he couldn't rewrite. Crockett, however, chose a different path. While the internet roasted Patel with memes and mockery, she saw the opportunity to transform the viral moment into something larger. To her, this wasn't just about a single victory or a single debate. It was about reminding people that dignity could stand its ground, that arrogance was fragile, and that truth, when spoken with courage, could still break through the noise. And so, even as the hashtags trended and the applause clips looped endlessly across screens, Crockett prepared to speak again. This time, not just to Patel, but to the millions who had found a piece of themselves in her words. Yet while the internet roasted Patel, Crockett used the moment to deliver something bigger. When the dust settled, Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium not as a victor savoring a personal triumph, but as a messenger carrying something larger. The viral moment was never just about her words or Patel's collapse. It was about what those words represented, an unshakable reminder that dignity can stand taller than arrogance, and truth can outlast every smirk, every interruption, every attempt to silence it. In the interviews that followed, Crockett made no effort to gloat. Instead, she reframed the exchange, telling audiences, this wasn't about one debate. It was about who we are as a country. She spoke of service over ego, of the countless Americans who fight every day not for attention, but for fairness. Her message resonated because it came from the marrow of her own story. She wasn't claiming to be a savior. She was holding up a mirror, showing people the quiet power they already possessed. The moral rang clear. Arrogance crumbles because it stands on nothing. It puffs itself up, but when challenged with authenticity, it collapses under its own weight. Crockett reminded viewers that true strength doesn't shout the loudest. It endures the longest. Her calm in the face of Patel's dismissiveness was proof that resilience is more commanding than bluster. For the millions who had watched, it was more than political theater. It was validation. Immigrant families who had been told they didn't belong saw belonging asserted with confidence. Women who had been dismissed in boardrooms or classrooms saw their dignity reflected in Crockett's composure. Young people weary of cynicism saw evidence that conviction could still shatter pretense. The moment became theirs as much as it was hers. Crockett's words became a rallying point, not for division, but for a shared truth, that justice, fairness, and courage are not partisan ideals. They're human ones. She left audiences with the charge to hold fast to their own dignity, no matter who tried to strip it away. And in that, the clash on stage transformed from spectacle into something more enduring, a parable for a divided nation. It whispered to every viewer that arrogance might win airtime, but it can never win history. What remains, what endures, is the steady, quiet force of those who refuse to bow. As the applause replayed and the memes multiplied, the deeper current was unmistakable. People weren't just laughing at Patel. They were standing taller with Crockett. And when the lights dimmed and the cameras turned away, her lesson lingered. Dignity had triumphed, and arrogance had been exposed for what it was. It wasn't the end of a debate. It was the beginning of a reminder. And the audience left not just entertained, but inspired, proud, and validated. Jasmine Crockett stunned Kash Patel on live TV with a comeback so sharp it left the audience in shock, and the lesson could not be clearer. In that moment, dignity stood tall while arrogance crumbled. This wasn't just a debate. It was a reminder of who we are when truth meets bluster, when courage confronts dismissal. The world saw Patel unravel, but more importantly, it saw dignity win. If you believe arrogance will always fall to resilience, if you believe dignity will always defeat hate, share this video and make sure this moment is never forgotten.